next 20 or so minutes, we're going to talk about old Southern apples that have a historic connection to cider, or through the experience with Lee and here at Horn Creek, we believe have the potential for making good cider. But the interesting thing is that those apples also, many of them, happen to be highly flavored apples that are good for eating. So even if you don't make cider or drink cider, you have a lot to learn in this session right here. Let me say a couple of things just to set the stage for cider and refer back to some of the things Lee has talked about many times before. He says that in the comment he made this morning was that in the apple we see the history of the agrarian South. And we see the apple not used just as a snack food like we see today, but in all of its uses. Early fruit, late fruit, apples grown for applesauce, apples grown for drying, like they do here at Horn Creek in some of their historic recreations, and also apples for cider. Now, as I mentioned, apples for cider are ideally highly flavored apples. Of course, you're interested also in sugar to ferment into alcohol. You're interested in acidity, which is something that's lacking in some modern apples that are out there today, that nice crispness. And then the final component, which is not necessarily a good trait for eating, is an apple that has some tannin. So that when you ferment those sugars into alcohol, there's some structure left in the apple to add body to the beverage. So the qualities that we're looking for in cider, complex flavor, sugar, and acidity, those all make for great eating apples. A tannic apple will give you a little bit different characteristic. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I guess my final point about cider is that one of the things that I feel that Lee communicates very strongly in everything that he does in talking about old Southern apples is that these apples are not just, these aren't dusty old history. This is not, information that was filed away in the 14-story building that is of no use today. Already some of the questions that you've had today about what can these old Southern apples give us, given our climate warming, these apples are current today, and what they talk about here at Horn Creek is relevant for today. So cider making is one thing that can keep these old varieties alive. I mean, there are people in this room who are grafting 50,000 cider apples, I think. Roland, Mary, is that right? And there are people who are planting, thousands and thousands of apples that are suited for cider making. And some of those should be apples from this collection here at Horn Creek. So I wanted to start off, and I'm just going to function as moderator here and pass the baton back and forth. And, Lisa and Lee will be sure to tell you that they are not cider makers, but it doesn't matter because we're talking about apples with complex flavor or historic connection to cider and good acidity. So I just thought I'd start with the question of, to both of you, which of we've talked about the Hughes crab, which we know about. What are some other Southern apples that have a historic connection to cider? Who wants to?
Yeah, there you go.
Hold
it right this way.
Yeah, I knew that question was coming, and in order to prepare myself, I went through my book for maybe the 100th time, and there are, I believe there are about, of the 400 or so extant Southern apples, there are about 40 that are said to have been used for cider. So you don't know whether the cider that was made from these apples was really, really good cider or just sort of run-of-the-mill cider, because Southerners made both kinds. In talking to elderly Southerners, when they talked about cider, often they would say they would use some sweet apples and some sour apples, sour meaning tart, and they would just throw them in there, grind them up, and make cider out of them. They didn't spend a lot of time worrying about, the proper mixture and this and that. They made cider, but they understood that cider should not be all sweet apples. There should be some acidic apples in the cider. So that was the thing I took away from most rural Southerners who made cider. They didn't particularly worry about what kind of apples they put in the cider, except they wanted some sweet apples, and they wanted at least half of the apples to have some acidity to them. And in that regard, did everybody have this list?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in your handouts, there's a paperclip together list of the Horn Creek apples, and then the handout behind that is a summary of Lee's annotated version of historic cider apples. Everybody see that page?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's something, if you're going to make cider, you have to be aware of when the apples get ripe. Because if you want to space out your cider making, make some in June, some in July, and August, September, you got to pick apples that get ripe in those particular time frames. So it's not just a good cider apple, it's a good cider apple that gets ripe in August, or a good cider apple that gets ripe in September or October that you have to worry about. So if you're doing your homework and you're thinking about cider apples, you can look for apples that historically have been used for cider, but also look for the time they get ripe. And there's some pretty good information in Old Southern Apples in the book about time of ripening in there. Now on this list, down at the bottom of the list, you'll see high sugar, acid, and some tannins. Everybody see that? I think most of those apples I recognize as being really good cider apples. The few that I'm not aware of, Cox's Orange Pippin, it's the most popular apple in Great Britain, but very, very sparsely grown in the South. Don't know much about it. But it's one of the best eating apples in the world, so I would suspect it would make good cider. Let's see.
And of those in that bottom list, Lee,
Yeah.
what regions in the South were they adapted to?
Let's see.
Just rough, not every
Yeah,
single one,
yeah.
but roughly, yeah.
All of those apples should grow anywhere in the South, north of northern Alabama. These are not apples that you should grow on the Gulf Coast, but anywhere from northern Alabama northward, these apples should do fine. I'd like to point out that last one there, Winter John. That's a most unusual apple. There is zero information in all the old sources of information that I looked at about that apple. It's not mentioned anywhere, but it was grown all over the South. I can't figure that out, how that disconnect came about. This particular apple, Winter John, is the latest ripening apple in my orchard. It doesn't get ripe until early November, and it'll hang on the tree until early December. And when I'm walking in my orchard in November, December, that's the only apple that's there. That's the one I pick and eat as I'm walking around. So, and it is sour as a lemon when you first think about picking it in early October. It's too sour unless you're really looking for a high acid apple. It's really too sour to eat or to press for cider. But if you wait until the end of November, it mellows. It's still tart, but it mellows, and I think it would make an excellent high acid apple for apple cider.
And I just know from talking to the orchard manager here that, he's getting around 20 bricks on Winter John, 19 or 20 bricks, which is really high sugar for an apple. So that combination of sugar and tart is really good.
Yeah. Realize
Sugar
that
measurement.
tart apples are not necessarily low in sugar. They're high in acid. So they can be high in sugar and high in acid and be a tart apple. So other apples that I look at there, of course, Grimes Golden. That's a famous cider apple. Originated in West Virginia.
Brooke County.
Good county. No. Wellsburg, wherever Wellsburg is.
Brooke County.
Brooke County? Yeah, that's where it originated. And there's a monument, granite monument there. It says Grimes Golden, right on the granite monument, because that's a famous apple and a very famous cider apple. And the tree bears prodigiously. So it's one you ought to think about growing. Another one there that I would point out is Terry Winter, next to the last apple. That is a Georgia apple, North Georgia apple. It is, how can I put this? It has a flavor unlike any other apple I've ever eaten. It has it's hard to describe, sort of a nutty, meaty flavor to it that I find to be wonderful eating apple. I'm not sure how it would come through in cider, but I believe it would be a delicious addition to cider apples. And the tree is a heavy bearer. And so that might be one to be worth looking at. Let's see. Now notice Roxbury, Russet, and Keener seedling. Those are both russet apples. Now most apples have smooth skin and have a natural wax on the skin of the apple. Russet apples have rough skin, no wax. And russet apples tend to be really good for cider. And those two in particular are russet apples. There are other russet apples around, but those are two really good ones. There's several others listed above, in the list above there, so.
Lisa, do you want to talk
Okay,
about, say some things about Jason too?
I will. Unfortunately, Jason Bowen, our horticulturist, could not be here today. But several years ago, he started working with a researcher at Appalachian State University, Dr. Seth Cohen, and they have actually tested all of the apples in our Southern Heritage Apple Orchard. Seth is going to publish all of that information in about a year, so it will be available and you'll have more than what we have given you here. I asked Jason for his list, and what you have to understand is any list that any of us give you is based on our taste palettes. So this is Jason's list of apples that he would combine for cider. The first one is Hughes Crab. That's the most celebrated apple in the South for making cider. And he likes it not only for the flavor, but its keeping ability. The next one on his list was Wine Sap. Again, good keeping ability. The tree bears a good crop every year, and the flavor has a snap or a twang to it. Third apple he had on here was Harrison, and it's known as a major cider apple in New Jersey, but he likes that particular apple for its sweetness. And then the final apple on his list was Winter John. Because it ripens late, it rates well in terms of the high sugar content and the tannin. And then he had listed subacid with a flavor uniquely its own.
So we might take some questions. We've got a few more minutes before we break for lunch. We've got such a big group, we might leave a little bit more time for lunch and book purchase and orchard nose purchase. But what questions do you have for for Horn Creek and for Lee about cider apples or cider in general.
Diane, I'd actually like to ask you a question. Which Pippin did you use for your Pippin Gold?
We use the Newtown Pippin, sometimes called Albemarle Pippin, and you might speak about that name. Yeah.
Well, Virginians take great pride in the Albemarle Pippin. They believe it's been originated in Virginia and been grown there since the Revolutionary War. I did a lot of research on it, and it appears that the Albemarle Pippin is identical to an old apple called Yellow Newtown Pippin, which actually, excuse me for saying this, is a Yankee apple. But probably originated in the Hudson River Valley of New York. But it grows to perfection in Virginia, so they can certainly take that as part of their pat on the back. So it is a terrific cider apple. I know that you grow them, don't you, Diane?
I do,
Yeah.
and
You want to talk about them?
Yeah, there are a lot of orchards, and there are growers in the room. Mary and Raoul and others grow Albemarle Pippin or Newtown Pippin, as I prefer to call it. And there's a big orchard in Bent Mountain of Newtown Pippin apples, really old orchard that Mr. Witt had. Ricky, do you have any? Bethany and Courtney, do y'all have any Newtown Pippins? Yeah. What other questions do you have?
The acidity in some of these apples, is that independent of your soil preparation? Because
I don't know how to answer. I don't think so.
Which is
She's asking if the acidity is related to the soil pH.
soil pH.
I don't think so.
Or just quality?
I don't get it.
The soil pH affects the growth of the tree, for sure. Apples really prefer pH close to neutral, close to 7. And they're heavy feeders of calcium, so you need to put plenty of calcium down, which of course is going to bring the pH up. But as far as affecting the fruit, other than the size of the fruit, which might be smaller on calcium deficient soils, I don't know of any other effect. Yes, sir.
I think most of the agronomist literature would say yes, the soil pH does not affect the flavor or the acidity of the apple, but it would be definitely affected by weather. So cooler places will be more acidic, and it will be definitely affected by timing of picking. You tend to pick early, just to have more acid, less sugar. If you wait until the start falling off the tree, or you pick it up off the ground, it's going to be much sweeter and have lower acidity.
Dr. Tony Wolfe at Virginia Tech has done some research on the elevation effect on acidity in apples and also flavor and I think some textural components, and you can find that research online at the Virginia Tech fruit page. But he documents that apples grown at higher elevation have higher acidity, and he believes they have more complex flavor. I'm not sure exactly how he judged that.
Fighting words.
Yeah, fighting words, huh?
When we planted our orchard for cider, we tried to take into account when they would be ripe so we could spread out our cider making. But the challenge we've had is twofold. One is that early blooming things like the Hughes crab, which we love, with these crazy winters, the blooms will keep on getting taken out by these late freezes. So we're losing something that would have been sort of on the early end. But even those earlier apples, the June and July apples, we're having challenges pressing them because maybe they're good for sauce, they want to extrude out of the press. So I didn't know if you had any suggestions for the flesh composition of an apple that's more crisp, that's earlier ripening, or apples that ripen early but have a late bloom, which I don't know if that even exists, but something that is not going to bloom so early that it then gets taken out by a freeze.
Those are really good practical questions that any cider maker who grows fruit has experienced those problems.
So as I understand it, my hearing is not what it used to be, but I understood you to say that apples that tend to have a crisp texture tend to press better for cider.
The type of presses that we've used, The bladder press and a squeeze box press and even a wrap and cloth, they tend
They
to press
do,
better.
yeah, okay.
The other ones slide and just.
Yeah, they
shoot on
smear,
out.
yeah,
Turn
they,
the
yeah,
sauce.
yeah, and they gum up the cloth too, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Mhm. Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. So, I've made cider a couple of times, but I'm pretty primitive in my methods, so I didn't run into that. But
Are there early ripening apples that are more crisp fleshed, or are they all the kind that kind of become mushy?
let me run through a few in my brain here. Let me see. I think you'd have to get into August apples before you had any chance of getting apples with a crisper texture that might press better. I don't know of any June or July apples that are like that.
I saw some other hands up.
I'm not a cider grower of apples, but I am always curious to hear what people's I guess routines for care of their orchard, making sure that it's healthy, either on the front end or on the back end. Trying to understand what people's routines are for taking care of their apples, so diseases are less prevalent, or is it holistic management? Is it spray? Like, I'm just curious.
Yes.
We'll be having a 5-day seminar on that subject.
You will?
Yeah. There are lots of growers in the room who are much more skilled at orchard management than I am. As a cider apple grower, we only controlled for those diseases and pests that affect the quality of the fruit or the health of the tree. The appearance of the fruit is not important if you're going to smush it up and grind it and spray and ferment it. But apples require some care. I mean, people see these apples growing out in the woods. They're like, oh, I can plant that by itself. But when you have an orchard, you have a monoculture. So it's like having a tomato patch. You're going to get insects and disease that are attracted to that. So you need a management system, whether it's the integrated pest management or trying to have a more holistic approach or a more conventional approach. That's up to you and your climate and the quality of fruit you're aiming for. But you need to have a plan. Is that the safest growers out there? Is that the safest thing? Have a plan? Yeah.
I want to also speak to that.
Yes.
Okay, so where we have 425 varieties in the Southern Heritage Apple Orchard, the bloom times are spread out much longer than typical if you had 3 or 4 different varieties. And when we started this, I was told straight out by a Surrey Ag Extension agent who had tried to raise 50 varieties in Surrey County that what we were going into was a nightmare. And he said, I don't know that you can do it. The reason this orchard is still alive is because of Lee's expertise and Jason's expertise. We have to be real proactive. You could not grow those apple trees over there if you weren't very proactive in terms of sprays.
Fire blight is a nightmare. It's pure and simple. I lost almost 200 trees in 1 year to fire blight, so it's terrible. One thing Jason has done, which has really reduced the amount of fire blight in the Southern Heritage Apple Orchard, is the use of apogee. Apogee is a chemical which reduces the growth of water sprouts and new growth on the trees. And that growth is very susceptible to fire blight. And by reducing that growth, you get rid of most of fire blight in the orchard. So if you haven't investigated the use of apogee for fire blight control, you might want to check into it. I wish he was here because he made that discovery himself, and there were times early in the history of this orchard over here where in May every tree in there was brown from fire blight, and it was disheartening to say the least. It was terrible. But since he started using apogee and some other things, he has controlled the fire blight beautifully. Not to say he's eradicated it, because I don't think you ever will in an apple orchard, but he's reduced it to a manageable size.
I want to
Can you
say,
spell that?
Apogee, apogee.
I want to also say one more thing. Horn Creek has a staff of 4 permanent members working here. So right now, with the Hoosier Orchard and the Southern Heritage Apple Orchard, we have about 900 apple trees, not apple trees, 900 fruit trees in the ground. So we're real dependent on volunteers. And Jason not only is responsible for over there, but he also has responsibilities over here. So it's a real balancing act for us. Sometimes the orchard demands more work, sometimes the farm does. But we also see about 30,000 people a year and do 12 to 14 special events. So for him to keep that orchard alive, he's doing something very, very right.
And a statement to the apples too.
Very.
Yeah. When we first started the orchard, we actually used inmates from a local correction facility to help get the trees in the ground, and that was had its pluses and minuses, believe me. But one worker and I planted 800 trees by ourselves, so that was tough. It wasn't until Jason Bowen came along that this apple orchard had the proper care that it should have. He is a graduate from NC State. He's a horticulturist. He knows what he's doing. He's an expert. He is tireless. And I can't imagine the Southern Heritage Apple Orchard without Jason Bowen taking care of it. So if any of you have any pull with the people in Raleigh, don't let them get rid of this guy, because he is unbelievable. We are not organic. I personally tried to be organic. I was organic in my own orchard for 10 years, and I ended up facing the music. I was doing a hell of a lot of work, and not much was coming out the other end. So I went what I call a low spray program. Most of my sprays early in the season when there's a lot of diseases and a lot of insects, and then not much spraying after that. And I ended up getting a lot better fruit than I had before. So there are different levels of chemical controls. You need to look for where you're comfortable with using chemical sprays, and once you find something that works for you and it's not going to poison the earth, then you need to stay there and use it. So that's about all I'm going to say about it.
All right, okay. Take one more question and then we'll break for lunch.
In your search through the literature, did you see what historically Southerners would use to combat fire blight or cedar rust, or did you see any techniques, in other words, industrial chemistry?
What'd you say?
What did old folks use to combat apple disease? So like arsenic and things
What
like
chemical?
Pre,
pre-modern.
Yeah. You talking about me personally?
No, back in the old days.
Back in the orchard?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd have to have Jason Bowen to talk about that. I don't know what chemicals he uses.
Did you find anything in the literature when you were doing research on how people combated the diseases back
Oh,
in
yeah.
the 1800s
Oh,
before?
yeah. Don't think for a minute they didn't spray. They did. And I'll tell you what they sprayed with: arsenic and lead.
The old Bordeaux.
Yeah. So what we're using now is 1,000 times less poisonous than what they used back then. There are stories of farmers dropping dead in the fields on a sprayer. So, yeah.